Wolfgang Pfitzenberger, dear members of the organization committee, dear all, it's truly my pleasure being here, and it's truly also my pleasure to present a talk which I have never given before, where I simply looked across the lifespan and searched for empirical evidence, what can be said for the different locations of people moving ahead while they're getting older. Of course, I'm taking risks. All of what I'm saying is entirely preliminary, and it may be wrong 6 months from now. It also may be right 10 years from now, so I don't know, except that this is a preliminary assessment, and this is how I labeled this talk as well. My keynote will have 4 different parts. First, I will very quickly, because here and there it has already been introduced in the last discussion, I will introduce some key analytical developments of the life course research. The second is that looking at the lifespan, not everybody is treated equally. This is obvious, but I really want to go step for step through the entire life course. My third point will be moving from the individual level to a more societal level, addressing challenges which we have to confront and probably also to solve. New cleavages which will arrive and which, in my opinion, do not disappear. And the last point is, and this is what the organizers wanted me to do, because it's the title of the conference, draw inferences for policy and research. So, Chapter 1, Basics of Life Course Research. You all know the Lexis diagram distinguishing, this is why I did refer to you, between period effects, cohort effect, and age effects. I don't think that I have to explain what age effects, and it's you increase the amount of wrinkles over time, but possibly your wisdom as well. And it happens to everybody, and for period effects, the best textbook example, of course, is the introduction of the anti-baby pill, which affected everybody at the same time, also, of course, certain people more than others. And then cohort effects, which means that one age group together moves through history with some shared attitudes, shared opinions, and probably also behavior. Now, when you read the newspapers and sometimes also articles, it often said, well, this is a generation COVID, or the generation C for generation Zoom, which I think is mistaken, because if you think about the COVID pandemic, there are only some who are infected, but all of us are affected in one way or this other. But of course, talking about COVID as a period effect does not mean that some cohorts are hit more than others, so that you also have cohort effects. And I will make the point that the young generation in particular will have long-lasting scars. When we talk about effects of COVID, whether those are period effects, cohort effects, the question, of course, is what are we looking at? And being here at the IAB, of course, we are looking at labor markets. We are looking at the rise of unemployment. We are looking at the loss of work time. We are looking at retirement schedules, all of that. Sure, homework, short-time work, all of this may be effects. But just think about that, it's much more than that. We are also see many studies which are concerned about satisfaction, which are concerned with loneliness of people, which are concerned with questions of participation and integration, with family formation, with death and fertility. I cannot talk to all those possible outcomes or possible impacts of the corona crisis at all, because some of them we can't see at the moment at all. Like on death, we only see 1 week, and this was the second week in April, where we in Germany had more people dying compared to the average of the last 5 years. In fertility, we can't see anything right now, so we have to wait a little bit. In terms of divorce rates, we do not have stable data, so I can't entertain you with any results in that, but I have to look at those indicators which have been primarily researched, and this is on labor market and partially on satisfaction. This is a first sort of hope which I have that, and I will argue in my very last chapter about this, that people working on satisfaction, people working on loneliness really do not meet people working on the changes in the workplace, because as we all know, there are direct and indirect effects between those two strengths of indicators. We also have to distinguish, and I said this already quite often, short-term effects from middle-term and long-term effects. And I can only give you some literature review about short-term effects, but of course there is a broad literature on how former crises affected the life course of people. And I will draw from time to time to this literature as well. This does not mean that we can one-to-one implement developments which we have seen in the past to developments which we expect in the consequence of COVID-19. I will also tell you that if you are interested in the interrelation between life courses and COVID-19, there is one article which appeared, I think, 2 or 3 days ago, and therefore I could not fully use this. And this is an article written by Richard Sanderson and a huge team of quite interdisciplinary trained people, just published in the Advances of Life Course Research. So I turn to chapter 2, which is on the socio-economic phase of the pandemic. One of the very first articles which appeared was written by a team around Carsten Schröder from the sub-team, and it's called Erwerbstätige sind vor dem Covid-19-Virus nicht alle gleich. So this is probably not amazing, but all research having been done so far shows exactly this. Starting from a life course perspective, I of course first focus on small children, and here we do not know anything. In the moment we have to wait for the national panel study on education, the NEPS, where the ERB works closely together, and I'm very grateful for this with the WZB in Bamberg, of course, as well. But there are a lot of theories around and a lot of empirical evidence from former crises. Just remember the book from Glenn Elder, Children of the Great Depression, that it may be that the toddlers really will suffer most moving through their life course, or probably develop in particular well, given that the parents were around, that the mothers took care. But on the other side, they lost territory, they lost interaction with strangers, they lost childcare, they lost sort of developing their self-esteem. But this is an entirely unsolved question. In the past, we primarily talked about recessions, economic downturns, without having people around caring for children, but it's an extremely important point which needs to be researched. Moving a little bit above toddlers, we of course know a lot already. And this of course means the increasing divide in educational and competence attainment of children dependent on the household they grow up with. As you know, Germany is a country which depends extremely on the background of the parents looking at the educational possibilities, educational chances of young children. I usually say, pre-birth, I got my high school certificate and my son got it pre-birth as well, because we were both raised in academic families and were quite unlikely not to gain the Abitur. And this social inheritance, of course, extremely increased during the last couple of months. And it could be observed. We also have the first data, given that well-educated parents took the time for homeschooling, less educated persons couldn't do this at all. And what I found most impressive and depressing is that those parents actually felt ashamed, because everybody, if you are a parent, then you want to do the best for your children, and they were sitting there with empty hands, not able to provide anything. And then the long vacancies started and vacations started, and then the school was over at, I think in Berlin at least, at 11:15 due to climate conditions. And I have a lot of contact to poor SES people, and they are absolutely depressed and damaged by this development and for not being able to give their children what they think their children deserve. Heinz-Elmar Tenort, a very prominent education historian, labels this as a re-feudalization, and I strongly go with this expression of him. This is what we are seeing, and there is no indication whatsoever that the lack of education and the lack of increased competencies over the last 7 months will be healed in the next years to come. Those will be ongoing scars. For a country, a rich country like Germany, this is a huge embarrassment, I think. Moving from childcare to schooling, and now to the transition from school to vocational training, you are much more experts than I am, but studies have already shown many frictions, such as unwanted waiting times, moving back home due to financial problems from former crises. We also know that children tend to continue schooling during economic downturns, even if they had intended to leave school to take up vocational training. We also know that young adults, if they have a university entry certificate, are more likely to continue studying rather than taking up vocational training, even if they intended to engage in vocational training before. Poorly educated persons, again, do not have this option to continue schooling at all. They are left looking at apprenticeships in the labor market, and all this taken together, of course, prompts huge misfits between the demand and supply side. I highly recommend a nice piece written by Tobias Meyer from the BIP for more detail, and he also shows that poorly educated school leavers are hit most by the COVID crisis. The third step to be taken is a transition from training to work. And may I ask you to not speak up as much, please? Thank you. This helps me a lot because I hear you more than I hear myself. The third point is a transition from training to work. And here you could say that, well, we have a quite similar picture across all countries of which I found data, but that they are less severe in Germany than in other countries. We have an increase in the needs in the people, not in education, in employment, in training, but it's not jumping up as much as we thought it would. We have an increase in unemployment, but again, it's lower than expected. But we think that youth unemployment will rise more than it does now. What we know from former research is that even trainees which manage now to find a job, a forced entry position, it will take some time until they are on the level of previous cohorts entering the labor market. Lisa Kahn showed that in recent crises, graduates from college suffered long time, highly negative and consistent negative consequences. Now, the fourth point is probably the best known point, and this is what happens to people who are already at work. And here again, citing the SERP paper, but also papers written by scholars of the IAB shows that there are probably 20% who work in short-time work, and then 30% who can work at home permanently, and 30% who can work at home from time to time. So this is the first rather robust result. Another one is that the total labor force reduced the work time at an average of 4 hours per week. Again, education matters a lot. Better educated workers are primarily working at home. Poorly educated, low-income workers primarily were in short-time work. A very, very clear division and clear split in the labor market. Previous research also tells us that low-educated persons in the labor market will face a higher reduction in work time and therefore lose over the entire lifespan income, tremendous amount of lifetime income, while higher educated people do not lose jobs, but they lose a proportion of their wages and therefore also reducing life income. And this is a piece by Matthias Umkehrer that job losses are higher in regulated jobs, while wage decreases are more likely in less regulated occupations and firms, which I found very interesting in combination with the first result I just quoted. Another component, of course, is that household composition, sex and migrant status make a huge difference. So it's not just education on which I focused so much before. Focusing on women, Nicola Fuchs-Schundeln and Gesine Stephan have shown, among many others, that women are more likely to decrease their work time. They were more likely to be exposed to health risks due to the overrepresentation in essential work, being torn between childcare and labor force demands. Women with small children, this is also a very consistent result, show much higher level of exhaustion and were more affected overall by the pandemic. They are also more likely to work at home while caring for children, increasing their share of unpaid work even above the share they worked before. We can also see that in some household compositions, so if the woman is in essential work and the man is at home, in those conditions, under those conditions, the gender care gap decreases, which is not an argument which really convinces me that no process of re-traditionalization, as I call it, will evolve, but this is probably a point of discussion later. Now, the next step, of not being too long on this very descriptive part, is on old age. And here the IAB, but the ZDW and the all institutes found that older workers are not affected as much as had been thought before, much less so. They have some decrease of working time, but it's lower than the average. They have, however, and this is stressed in many papers, much longer consequences due to, if they have been infected, then this may sort of interact with their future employment career. Labor force inequalities increase not by different socio-economic groups only, and not only by sort of education or household composition, migrant status, and any combination of those, but also by firms. This has been a very nice paper by Thomas Kruppe, who showed that 45% of all firms in Germany compensated the difference between short-term work compensation and the salary level they earned before. And of course, there are huge differences across occupation, given, and this is what I already said, that some occupations can be easily done at home, while others can't, and that some workers are in those short-time work, some are in essential work conditions. All of what I just said holds for other nations as well. For the US, Laura Montenovo and others just published a very good paper by the National Bureau of Economic Research, showed extreme divides between education and in one sentence that rates are 46% lower among workers in jobs that they are more compatible with remote work in terms of job loss, and again pointing at the crucial role of education here as well. Retired people, and this is a recent publication by Axel Borsch-Zupan, suffer less. Their pension will be stable, while the wages of the entire workforce is of course expected to drop due to economic downturn and a rise in contribution to the pension funds. There is one development, however, which may also affect the elderly who continue or want to continue to work after retirement. And this are people who work in those 450 euro jobs not covered by Social Security, because we lose those jobs in particular. Now, after this extremely descriptive results going through different life stages, so the impact of education and household composition, I would like to move to chapter 3, which I call Challenges Old and New. I think that one of the major challenges which we have to master is the emerging stronger divide between skilled and unskilled labor force. So far, educated people could expect better work conditions with higher income, larger networks with strong and weak ties, better health, longer life expectancy. This is no news to all of us. Today, And I think well into the future, they may opt working at home, being independent of their offices and their firms, gaining time and gaining freedom to move, but not having to commute. People working, however, in low-skilled and system-relevant jobs do not have this option. And if you look at the size of those two groups, you see that half of the workforce, by all present estimations, may be working at home. And not just for a day, but for 4 days, probably even entirely. Recent research shows that most of those workers who are offered home office also opt for home office. And given the experience over the last 6 and 7 months, increasingly much so. They move to the countryside, to larger houses with lower rents, leaving behind those who have to be at their firms and factories. Firms, this is what we all see, and probably the IAB does this as well. I do this in the very moment. React, change office spaces, invest into digitalization in a tremendous way. We at the WZB are getting prepared for a large increase in homework, and we are getting prepared in changing our offices to much more co-working spaces and much more space where people simply can meet and exchange ideas, and try to incentivize this considerably so that they indeed come to the office. Rising inequalities in these living conditions, in the freedom to move, in the freedom to have options or not to have options, goes in parallel with rising inequalities in income. And this is something which should really make us think more than we think about this in these days, where home office is more and more something nice to have, and we much more talk about the advantages rather than the downsides and what it means for future society and a future workforce with entirely different divisions between home and work, and some, including myself, even go so far saying that, and this is an old expression by Ali Hochschild, that the work is the home and the home is the work, but in a very, very different meaning from her. But even if you look within the group of people who may work at home, you see huge differences. We know by all research given so far and in the past that if women work at home for the most of their working time, they increase unpaid work, they increase work for childcare, and they increase also household work. And we know if men work at home, or if men go partially in part-time because they can't find full-time, there is no equivalent rise in unpaid work. And even worse, so Mareike Bünning shows that if men are back from part-time to full-time, they decrease the time even more than they had decreased it, or lower than before they moved into part-time work. This is one thing that even home office affects people quite unequally, and this is another reason why I'm sort of the one person right now who always says, well, please pay a little bit attention before you give the right for homework to everyone, to what may happen as unintended effects, and think about how we can heal unintended effects before introducing something. The other thing which is also happening within this group of home office potential workers is that not everyone who could work at home may be allowed to work at home. So I can't afford to have an empty WZB. So there must be some workers still being present at the WZB. But their work extremely changes. They are turning more and more to distributors of work and to people who can tell me how this or that or whatever person is doing. And we are not paying attention to this either. We are also not paying attention that they, of course, align their work at the WZB to the work of people outside the WZB, which changes their entire routines when they eat, when they have breaks and things like this. And we have to investigate this part as well. Now, this is the one challenge which I see, and a challenge which will be with us over the next decades. I'm sure about this. The other challenge which comes out of the pandemic is long known, and this has all to do with essential jobs, essential work. And there we complain since decades that people who are employed in caring jobs, in essential jobs, are paid under the worth. And now we applaud at them, but I can't see in this very minute that we do more than probably look a little bit closer on how they are doing. But we have to do something and not just talk about it. We must move ahead rather waiting for the next lockdown and increase the work conditions, which are very poor, and also their wages. As a sociologist, you won't be surprised that I also have to point to the risk of a further loss of social cohesion. As military service, civil service, engagement in churches or in political parties declined, employment became more and more important as a turnstile of social interaction. The workplace is where people met. And this becomes very clear if you look at empirical data asking, would you continue to work even if you would not need the money? And there are 40% who say yes. And if you ask them, so why that? Why wouldn't you enjoy your leisure and have a good time? They say, well, because I want to have the contact. I want to have a place outside my house. I want to interact. And this is, of course, I cannot judge about them, but for a sociologist, this is extremely important because we need places where people can meet, where they simply can see how other people behave. It does not even need to be a communication. It doesn't need to be a conversation. And this is all what trust is about. So if Georg Simmel says, well, you have to be able to form solid hypotheses on the behavior of people, and those hypotheses are the pure fundament for developing trust, then we need to see people in real. And I do not think that the digital world is a good replacement for this. You need to have joint areas. And the work gets lost due to this huge amount of hope office, should it be realized. Kenneth Arrow talks about trust as a social lubricant. And this is what a society needs. It is needed for those solid predictions Georg Simmel talked about and wrote long books about, but it's also needed for the democracy. We at the WZB just published 4 days ago the new results of the Demokratie Barometer, which showed that populist attitudes and sympathies for populist opinions decreased immensely. And this had nothing to do with the COVID, so it started way before the COVID. And they trace this causally. It's a question mark whether I trust this causal inference, but at least it goes hand in hand with much more interaction between politics and citizens. And this can be seen in all political parties. We need to have this interaction, and we cannot sort of sacrifice the workplace as places of social interaction. A lack of social interaction may truly also impact labor market outcomes. Knowledge about possible behavior of strangers may reduce stereotypes. We know this. There are lots of old theories about it, that contact, that just watching people, how they behave, matters for stereotyping. And if you look at the American literature over the last couple of months, you see an increasing literature on how stereotyping on the elderly increases. Just look at the hashtag Broomer Remover or thinning the herd and things like this. And this is not just ageism, it's also hitting people with color and migrant background. Stereotyping is increasing, and I can't make a causal inference that it has something to do with this physical distancing. But it's very likely that it does have something to do. So we need to find equivalent places for making people meet and to decrease this increase of discrimination again. I'm now at my chapter 4, Challenges for Research and Public Policy, and I will start with research. What we all have observed over the last 6 to 7 months is that the pandemic has accelerated the pace of our research. No question about this. A huge acceleration. We saw this, that the time for peer reviews decreased considerably. We saw this, that exchanges in networks and conferences suffered during the limitation of personal meetings or very, very rushed policy requests. Research failed to even exchange results before they promoted the results vis-à-vis media and politics. So it happened quite often to me, and I'm not an exception, that I learned from journalists what has been published by exclusive media coverage by people working in Mannheim, by people working in Nuremberg, by people working in Wiesbaden, and even work produced in Berlin by the DIW. This is not the way we can be successful in science. It's no way that we can give the power to order and to classify our results to either politicians or to journalists. This is a complete turn to what we have to do. We have to organize ourselves, and I'm not saying anything. I mean, this would not be me saying ever something like this. That we should be less transparent in our research, that we should decrease open access, that we should be not faster than we have been in the past. But we first have to talk to ourselves. We first have to join our wonderful data sets, or even compare them, or even try to figure out why one result differs from the other, and being able why this may be the case. And we should be in the lead. Journalists are extremely important to check this, no question about this. But it can't be the journalist picking the institutes and then defining what is right and wrong, and it can't be the politicians as well. This is truly the worst way to get back a lot of flaws lost in the public attention and the legitimacy science has for the civil society. So this is one of the big lessons I learned over the last 7 months, that we have to introduce platforms with which and with the help of which we can organize ourselves better, and this has to be done across disciplines and internationally. Otherwise, we will lose flaws even more than before. In terms of public policies, I think all what I have to say is very much straightforward. There is a huge need for education and training. This is not the first time that I'm saying this. We have to invest much more in digitalization and in combined ways of training our children in a digital and personal way. And develop ways of hybrid schooling, as you have a hybrid conference here. We also have to be much more innovative. There is no reason why we invented so many smart things helping the labor market and doing nothing for people losing their schools and their school education and the parents who suffered. We could have easily matched students who lost their work and didn't know what to live from, with parents who were in urgent need finding people to simply take care of their toddlers, sitting next to them when doing their homework and things like this. This happened in other countries. There are no serious, or I do not know about any serious initiatives here in Germany. We also have to invest in digitalization of our older citizens. They need this. It helps against isolation, and they have the interest and ability to do so, but we have to do more than them. So it's not just that we can limit ourselves to the labor force, we also have to increase, but this is what I say at each conference, continuous education and training for a second or third job, because what's happened now with this short-time work is, of course, holding people to the firms and therefore a slower movement in terms of the transformation of the labor force. So we have to do something in between and combine, as we did in the crisis before, link short-time work to further education. And I think above all, now finishing this first point on education, we have to see that education is a very, very strong pillar of social policy and therefore has to be introduced in all policy measures. Second, we need to put families and children and also women first. We still talk about them as a Gedöns, or in English as Fass. This has not changed. If you look over time of the pandemic, when the first time family issues have been raised, it took many, many weeks. And one good example is the first installment of the Leopoldina recommendations, which sort of suffers any paragraph on this, or holds it very low at least. We also have to use now time of home work and home office of men to increase their father's months of parental allowances to reach the one and only goal, at least in my perception, for more equality between men and women, and this means that they have an equal share of paid and unpaid time. This can be a window of opportunity which needs to be used. We have to do a lot for and this is the third point, for the protection of workers. We have to look at all those regulations around the right to home office, and I think it should be supplemented with the right to work at an office outside the home. We have fourth, look for new places to interact. I talked a lot about this, so I leave it with this simple statement. In the US, there are huge movements, Zoomers to boomers, for example, strong networks between students and the elderly. We have it in part with Nachbarschaftshilfe.de, but it's again decreasing, and we do not have enough public support for this. We also, and this is the sixth point, see that at least 30 to 35% of people say in surveys, and I just got the results of the new legacy study, that the COVID pandemic had something very good for them, which they want to continue and preserve. And there, of course, they talk about climate, they talk about the deceleration of their life, more time for families, more time, leisure for themselves, and things like this. I think we have to take those people seriously, and we have to learn more what they actually need and how this can be implemented in a new way of working and living in the future. And the last thing, and this is at the same time the first thing with which I started, given that science in these days is an extremely highly contested terrain, I hope that we will have many conferences and many personal interactions on pressing scientific issues in the future, much more so than in the last 7 months. Thank you very much.